The evening sun was setting over Pine Ridge Hospital as Dr. Angela Thompson gathered her belongings from her office. She'd just spent 12 exhausting hours in surgery, successfully removing a brain tumor from a young patient. Her shoulders ached, but a supple smile played on her lips. Another life saved, another family given hope. As she walked through the parking lot, the cool autumn breeze rustled through the trees. Her phone buzzed with a text from her husband. "Great job on the surgery, honey. Pick up some milk on your way home?" She chuckled, thinking about how he could always make her smile, even after the longest days. The drive was peaceful at first. Angela cruised down Maple Avenue in her navy blue Mercedes, a car she treated herself to after making partner at the hospital. The street lights were just starting to flicker on, casting a warm glow over the neat rows of Victorian-style homes in their new neighborhood. They'd moved here 3 months ago, drawn by the excellent schools and peaceful community. Still, she couldn't help but notice how some neighbors would stare a little too long when she gardened in her front yard or checked the mail. Tonight, though, something felt different. In her rearview mirror, she noticed a police cruiser that had been following her for the past few blocks. She checked her speed, exactly at the limit. Her registration was current, and all her lights were working. Still, that nagging feeling in her stomach grew stronger. The red and blue lights suddenly lit up behind her. Angela took a deep breath, remembering what her parents had taught her years ago. She pulled over carefully, positioning her car well off the road. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, but her mind remained clear. Years of performing high-stakes surgery had taught her how to stay composed under pressure. The officer approached, his boots crunching on the gravel. Officer Richard Baker, as his nameplate read, was a stocky man with cold eyes and a permanent frown etched into his face. His flashlight beam swept through her car before landing directly in her eyes, making her squint. "License and registration," he barked, not even bothering with a greeting. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over, officer?" Angela asked politely, keeping her voice steady and professional, the same tone she used when explaining complicated procedures to nervous patients. "I said license and registration," Officer Baker repeated, his voice rising. "This vehicle matches the description of one reported stolen in the area." Angela knew this wasn't true. She'd driven this route every day for months, and there hadn't been any reports of car theft in their upscale neighborhood. Still, she kept her movements slow and deliberate as she reached for her glove compartment. "I'm going to get my registration from the glove box, and my license is in my purse on the passenger seat." She narrated her actions clearly, just as her husband had advised. Being married to a federal agent had taught her a thing or two about traffic stops. "Just hurry up," Officer Baker snapped, his hand resting unsupplely on his holster. As Angela carefully pulled out her documents, she caught sight of her reflection in the side mirror. Even in the dim evening light, she could see the exhaustion in her eyes from the long surgery. She'd saved a life today, published research in leading medical journals, and given lectures to aspiring surgeons. Yet here she was, being treated like a criminal for driving her own car in her own neighborhood. The next few moments would change everything. As she handed over her license and registration, Officer Baker's face twisted into a sneer. He studied her license photo, then looked at her expensive car, designer watch, and professional attire with obvious suspicion. "Step out of the vehicle," he demanded, his voice dripping with contempt. "Officer, I don't understand. I've provided my documentation proving this is my car." "I said get out." His voice rose to a shout as he yanked open her car door, his other hand raised threateningly. What Officer Baker didn't know was that less than 50 feet away, Mrs. Chen from number 42 was walking her dog. And Mrs. Chen, a retired journalism professor with a strong sense of justice, had already pulled out her phone and started recording the moment she saw the police lights. She also didn't know that Angela's smartwatch had already sent her location to her husband, who was about to turn this situation completely upside down. Time seemed to slow down as Officer Baker's hand hovered in the air. Angela's heart pounded, but her voice remained steady. Years of handling medical emergencies had taught her to stay calm when it mattered most. "Officer, I'm a neurosurgeon at Pine Ridge Hospital. I've just finished a 12-hour surgery and I'm heading home." "There must be some misunderstanding," she explained, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel. The streetlights cast long shadows across her face as she spoke, her wedding ring catching the light as she gestured. Mrs. Chen, still recording from her position near a large oak tree, had been joined by Mr. Patterson, an off-duty high school teacher who lived across the street. They watched in silent concern as the scene unfolded, their presence serving as silent witnesses to what was happening. "I don't care if you're the Queen of England," Officer Baker sneered, his face twisted with barely concealed contempt. "This is an expensive car in a nice neighborhood, and something doesn't add up." His flashlight beam swept aggressively across the car's interior again, as if searching for evidence of a crime that didn't exist. Angela took another deep breath, thinking about her father's words from years ago: "Stay dignified, stay strong, but stay safe." She'd heard stories like this before, at medical conferences, at neighborhood gatherings from friends and colleagues. But experiencing it firsthand made her blood run cold. "Officer Baker," she said, reading his nameplate again. "I live at 1542 Oakwood Drive, just 3 blocks from here. I can show you my hospital ID, my medical license, and my property deed. They're all in my briefcase on the back seat." Her voice carried the same calm authority she used in the operating room when giving instructions to her surgical team. But Officer Baker wasn't interested in evidence that would disprove his assumptions. His hand moved from his holster to the car door handle, yanking it open with unnecessary force. The cool evening air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of freshly cut grass from nearby lawns, such a peaceful smell in such a tense moment. "Step out of the vehicle now," he demanded, his voice echoing down the quiet street. A porch light flicked on in a nearby house, another witness to the unfolding scene. Angela's smartwatch vibrated against her wrist, a message received. She knew without looking that it was from her husband. As head of the Federal Civil Rights Division, he had taught her about her rights, about staying calm, about documenting everything. Right now, her watch was doing more than just receiving messages. It was actively tracking her location and recording audio. Mrs. Chen had edged closer, her phone steady in her hands as she captured everything. Her small dog sat quietly at her feet, as if understanding the gravity of the moment. Mr. Patterson had pulled out his phone too, and the soft glow of his screen illuminated his concerned face. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again," Officer Baker growled, his body language becoming more aggressive. He reached for Angela's arm, his fingers grasping at her sleeve. That's when they all heard it, the distinct sound of multiple vehicles approaching at high speed. Headlights swept across the scene as 3 unmarked cars pulled up, their tires crunching on the asphalt. Officer Baker's grip on Angela's sleeve loosened slightly as he turned toward the newcomers, confusion flickering across his face. The street had suddenly become very crowded, and the balance of power was about to shift dramatically. The first car's door opened, and a tall figure stepped out, adjusting his suit jacket. Even in the dim evening light, the gold FBI badge on his belt gleamed clearly. Angela felt a wave of relief wash over her as she recognized her husband's familiar silhouette. Mrs. Chen was still recording, capturing every moment as more agents emerged from their vehicles. Mr. Patterson had moved closer too, standing near enough to serve as another witness but far enough to stay out of the way. Officer Baker's face had lost its aggressive sneer, replaced by something between confusion and dawning realization. His hand dropped from Angela's sleeve as if it had suddenly become hot to the touch. The evening breeze carried the sound of approaching sirens. Someone had called the local police department. Soon this quiet street would become the center of an investigation that would expose years of misconduct and force an entire department to face its deeply rooted problems. But for now, Angela remained perfectly still in her car seat, watching as her husband approached with the calm, measured steps of someone who had handled situations like this many times before. The tables hadn't just turned, they had been completely flipped over. "Good evening, Officer Baker," her husband said, his voice carrying the full weight of federal authority. "I'm Special Agent Thomas Wilson from the FBI's Civil Rights Division. We need to have a conversation about what's happening here." His tone was professional but carried an edge that made Officer Baker take an involuntary step backward. The neighborhood was now wide awake, with more porch lights flicking on and curious faces appearing in windows. What had started as a routine act of profiling was about to become a turning point, not just for Officer Baker, but for the entire police department. The night air grew thick with tension as Special Agent Wilson stood facing Officer Baker. The street had become an impromptu stage, with neighbors watching from their porches and windows as the scene unfolded beneath the yellow glow of street lamps. "I was just conducting a routine traffic stop," Officer Baker stammered, his earlier aggression melting away like ice in summer heat. His hand, which had been so quick to reach for his weapon earlier, now hung limply at his side. "A routine stop." Agent Wilson's voice was measured but firm. "Please explain why you attempted to forcibly remove my wife from her vehicle when she provided all requested documentation." He held up his phone, showing the active GPS tracking and audio recording from Angela's smartwatch. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her phone still recording. "I have everything on video," she announced, her voice clear and confident. From the moment he pulled her over, the way he spoke to her, his aggressive behavior, it's all here. Mr. Patterson joined in. "I saw it too." Dr. Thompson was completely cooperative, but the officer was hostile from the start. Other neighbors murmured in agreement, several holding up their phones to show they'd also captured parts of the incident. Local police sirens grew louder, and 2 patrol cars pulled up to the scene. Captain Rodriguez stepped out, taking in the situation with experienced eyes. She'd been investigating internal complaints about Officer Baker for months, but previous incidents had always lacked solid evidence. "Captain," Agent Wilson addressed her professionally, "we have multiple witnesses and video evidence of what appears to be a clear civil rights violation. My team will need access to Officer Baker's complete service record, including all civilian complaints and internal investigations." Angela remained in her car, watching the situation unfold through her windshield. Her hands had stopped shaking, and now she felt a different emotion rising: determination. How many others had faced similar treatment but lacked the protection of her resources and connections? The neighbors had formed a small crowd now. Among them was Mrs. Johnson, who stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "Last month he did the same thing to my son. We filed a complaint, but nothing happened. Nothing ever happens." More voices joined in, each with their own story. It was like a dam breaking, years of silence giving way to a flood of testimonies. Officer Baker's face grew paler with each new account. Captain Rodriguez pulled out her notebook, recording names and dates. This wasn't just about tonight anymore, it was about a pattern, a system that had allowed such behavior to continue unchecked. Agent Wilson's team had spread out, efficiently gathering witness statements and contact information. They worked with the precision of people who had handled many civil rights cases, but the anger in their eyes showed this one felt personal. "Officer Baker," Captain Rodriguez finally spoke, her voice heavy with authority, "surrendered your badge and weapon. You're on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation." The words fell like hammer blows in the quiet street. As Baker slowly unpinned his badge, his hands trembling slightly, Angela finally stepped out of her car. She stood tall, her doctor's coat still draped over her arm, a symbol of her profession, her achievements, and the respect she'd earned. "This isn't just about me," she addressed the gathered crowd, her voice carrying the same strength she used when teaching medical students. "It's about every person who's ever been profiled, every complaint that was ignored, every voice that wasn't heard." Mr. Patterson pulled out his phone again, but this time to make a call. "Hello, Channel 7 News. You might want to send someone to Oakwood Drive. There's a story here you need to hear." The night had grown cooler, but nobody moved to leave. Neighbors brought out chairs and blankets, sharing stories they'd kept quiet for too long. What started as a frightening traffic stop had transformed into something more, a moment of community solidarity, of truth-telling, of change beginning to take root. Agent Wilson's team collected the video evidence from Mrs. Chen and other witnesses, ensuring every moment was preserved for the investigation to come. They knew from experience that cases like this needed to be handled perfectly. No detail could be overlooked, no testimony ignored. As local news vans began arriving, their bright lights illuminating the street like artificial day, Angela looked at the growing crowd of neighbors. She saw determination in their eyes, a shared resolve that this time would be different. This time, there would be accountability. Captain Rodriguez was already on her phone, calling for an emergency meeting with the police commission. The ripples from tonight would spread far beyond this quiet street, touching every corner of the department, challenging old systems and demanding change. The night that had started with fear and anger was ending with something else: hope. Hope carried in the voices of neighbors finally speaking their truth, in the diligent work of investigators gathering evidence, in the quiet determination of good officers like Captain Rodriguez, who wanted to see real change. As midnight approached, the crowd slowly dispersed, but everyone knew this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, the start of conversations too long delayed, of changes too long deferred, of justice too long denied. The morning after the incident, the local police station buzzed with unusual activity. Captain Rodriguez sat in her office, surrounded by stacks of personnel files and complaint reports. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten as she uncovered a disturbing pattern in Officer Baker's service record. "Look at this," she said to Agent Wilson, who stood reviewing documents nearby. 3 years ago, a college student filed a complaint about aggressive behavior during a traffic stop. The investigation was closed without action. She pulled out another file. 2 years ago, a retired teacher reported similar conduct. Again, nothing done. Agent Wilson nodded grimly, adding these to the growing pile of evidence. His team had worked through the night, interviewing witnesses and collecting statements. Mrs. Chen's video had already gone viral, catching the attention of national news networks. Down the hall, in the station's conference room, more FBI agents combed through years of department records. Their investigation had expanded beyond Officer Baker, looking at how complaints were handled, who made decisions about investigations, and why so many similar incidents had been swept under the rug. "Chief." A young officer knocked on the conference room door. "The press is gathering outside. They're asking for a statement about last night." The police chief, a man who'd prided himself on running a tight ship, now faced the hardest day of his career. The evidence was impossible to ignore. His department had failed its community, and he shared responsibility for that failure. Meanwhile, at Pine Ridge Hospital, Angela was finishing her morning rounds. Her patients noticed something different about her today: a new determination in her step, a stronger purpose in her voice. News of last night's events had spread quickly through the hospital staff. Dr. Thompson, a young nurse, approached her between patient visits. "My brother had almost the same thing happen to him last month. Would the FBI be interested in hearing his story too?" This scene repeated throughout the day, people coming forward, sharing experiences they'd kept quiet about for years. Angela kept a small notebook, carefully recording names and contact information for Agent Wilson's team. Back at the station, the investigation took an unexpected turn when a retired police sergeant reached out to Captain Rodriguez. "I tried to report Baker's behavior 5 years ago," he explained over the phone, his voice heavy with regret. "But my superiors said speaking up would hurt department morale. I've regretted staying quiet ever since." By afternoon, the story had caught fire on social media. The video Mrs. Chen captured had been shared thousands of times, drawing attention from civil rights organizations and police reform advocates across the country. Local news channels parked their vans outside the police station, waiting for updates. In a quiet corner of the station, Officer Baker sat with his union representative, watching his career crumble. The bravado from last night was gone, replaced by the stark realization that this time there would be no brushing things under the rug, no quiet transfer to another department. Agent Wilson's team had set up a temporary office in a community center, making it easier for people to come forward with their stories. The line of people waiting to speak stretched down the block: parents, teachers, doctors, students, all with similar experiences to share. "I never thought anyone would actually listen," an elderly gentleman told the agents, his hands trembling as he described his encounter from 6 months ago. "But seeing what happened last night, seeing that doctor stand her ground and that neighbor record everything, it gave me courage." The investigation revealed more than just individual incidents. It exposed a system of informal practices that had protected officers like Baker while silencing victims. Captain Rodriguez discovered that complaint forms were sometimes misplaced, witnesses were discouraged from coming forward, and officers who spoke up faced subtle retaliation. By evening, the police chief called an emergency meeting with the city council. The evidence was undeniable, and the public demand for action was too strong to ignore. The department needed more than just disciplinary action against one officer, it needed fundamental reform. In the hospital cafeteria, Angela sat with her colleagues during a brief dinner break. They weren't just discussing medical cases tonight. They were talking about change, about responsibility, about using their voices to make a difference. "You know," a senior surgeon said, pushing his salad around thoughtfully, "I've worked in this city for 30 years. Every doctor here has stories about being pulled over, about being questioned, about being treated with suspicion. But this is the first time I feel like something might actually change." As night fell again, Agent Wilson returned home exhausted but determined. The investigation was far from over, but something important had shifted. People weren't just angry anymore. They were hopeful, engaged, ready to work for real change. The local news ended their evening broadcast with a powerful image: a long line of people still waiting outside the community center, each holding a story that needed to be heard, each ready to be part of the solution. The anchor's voice carried a note of optimism as she reminded viewers that sometimes the biggest changes start with one person refusing to be silenced, one neighbor brave enough to bear witness, one community strong enough to demand better. 2 weeks after the incident, the FBI investigation had uncovered far more than anyone expected. Agent Wilson sat in his office, reviewing the preliminary findings with his team. The wall behind him was covered with photos, timelines, and connection maps, each piece telling part of a larger story. "We've interviewed over 200 people," his lead investigator reported, flipping through a thick folder. "The pattern is clear. Officer Baker's actions weren't isolated incidents, they were symptoms of a deeper problem." Down at City Hall, the mayor called an emergency press conference. The normally bustling lobby had been transformed into a makeshift media center with cameras and reporters packed tightly together. The air felt heavy with anticipation. "Based on the FBI's preliminary findings," the mayor announced, her voice steady but concerned, "we're implementing immediate changes in our police department. Every complaint from the past 5 years will be reviewed by an independent committee. We're also establishing a civilian oversight board with real power to investigate and recommend action." In the audience, Angela sat next to Captain Rodriguez. Both women had become unexpected symbols of change: the doctor who stood her ground and the police captain who chose integrity over institutional loyalty. The investigation had revealed shocking statistics. Officer Baker had received 47 complaints over his career, but only 3 had made it into his official record. The others had vanished into a system designed to protect its own at the cost of public trust. At the community center, a support group had formed spontaneously. People gathered every evening to share their stories, offer comfort, and plan for change. Tonight, the room was packed as usual. "I never reported what happened to me," a young teacher shared, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "I thought nobody would believe me. But now, seeing all of you here, knowing we're not alone anymore, it gives me strength." The local police station was undergoing its own transformation. Captain Rodriguez had been promoted to interim chief after her predecessor's resignation. Her first act was to establish an open-door policy for officers who wanted to report misconduct. "We can't change the past," she told her officers during a morning briefing, "but we can learn from it. From today forward, we serve our community with respect, integrity, and accountability. Anyone who can't commit to that has no place on this force." The investigation's ripple effects reached far beyond the city limits. Police departments across the state began reviewing their own complaint procedures. Civil rights organizations used the case to push for legislative changes. What started as one traffic stop had become a catalyst for systemic reform. In the hospital break room, Angela found herself surrounded by colleagues sharing their own experiences. Dr. Phillips, a veteran surgeon, spoke about being stopped 3 times in 1 month on his way to emergency surgeries. Dr. Chen described how she changed her route home to avoid certain police precincts. "But things feel different now," Dr. Phillips noted, hope clear in his voice. "For the first time, people are really listening. Real changes are happening." The FBI investigation revealed a troubling pattern of supervisors who had enabled Baker's behavior. Some had actively covered up complaints, while others had looked the other way. Each discovery added another piece to the puzzle of how such misconduct had persisted for so long. Mrs. Chen, whose video had helped spark the investigation, found herself receiving messages from people across the country. Some shared similar stories, others asked for advice about recording police interactions, and many simply thanked her for having the courage to get involved. "I just did what any good neighbor should do," she told a local reporter. "When you see something wrong, you have to speak up. One person's voice might seem small, but when we all speak together, we can move mountains." The police department's internal culture was shifting too. Young officers, who had felt pressured to stay quiet about misconduct, now found their voices. The blue wall of silence was crumbling, replaced by a new understanding that true loyalty meant holding each other accountable. One evening, as Agent Wilson reviewed more case files, he received an unexpected visitor. A retired police sergeant who had served with Baker years ago came forward with old diaries documenting incidents he'd witnessed but felt powerless to stop. "I should have done this years ago," the sergeant admitted, his hands shaking as he handed over the notebooks. "Maybe if I had, some people would have been spared what they went through. But I was afraid, and I have to live with that." The investigation's findings painted a picture of systemic failures, but also pointed the way toward real solutions. It wasn't just about removing bad officers, it was about changing the culture that protected them, rebuilding trust with the community, and creating systems of true accountability. As the sun set over the city, Angela stood at her hospital office window, watching the streetlights come on. Her phone buzzed with another message from the community center, more people wanting to share their stories, more voices joining the call for change. She thought about how one moment, one decision to stand firm, one neighbor's courage to record what she saw, had set all this in motion. The path ahead was long, but for the first time in years, it felt like real change was possible. The city was awakening to a new reality, where silence was no longer an option and justice was no longer just a dream. 1 month after the incident, the city courthouse buzzed with activity. The morning sun streamed through tall windows as people filed into the main hearing room. Officer Baker sat at one table with his lawyer, his once crisp uniform replaced by a civilian suit that seemed to hang loosely on his shoulders. At the other table, federal prosecutors had arranged stacks of evidence files, hundreds of pages documenting a career marked by abuse of power. In the gallery, community members filled every seat, their presence a silent testimony to years of unheard voices. Agent Wilson stood near the entrance, watching as more people arrived. The case had grown far beyond a single traffic stop. Today's hearing would address not just Baker's actions, but the system that had protected him for so long. "All rise," the bailiff called out, his voice echoing through the packed courtroom. The judge, a veteran of the bench known for her fairness, took her seat and surveyed the room with experienced eyes. The prosecution's opening statement laid bare the full scope of their findings. "Your Honor," the lead prosecutor began, "what happened that night was not an isolated incident. We have documented 47 similar complaints over Officer Baker's career. But more importantly, we've uncovered a pattern of institutional failure that allowed these incidents to continue." In the gallery, Mrs. Chen sat with her neighbors, her phone safely tucked away today. Her video evidence had already done its job, sparking an investigation that had grown beyond anything she'd imagined. Next to her sat the retired teacher who'd filed a complaint 2 years ago and the college student whose report had been ignored. The evidence presentation began with Angela's incident, but quickly expanded to include years of similar stories. Each account added another piece to a puzzle that revealed a troubling picture of systemic abuse. On April 15th, 3 years ago, the prosecutor continued, a medical student was pulled over without cause. On September 3rd, 2 years ago, a business owner reported similar treatment. On December 12th last year, a retired veteran faced the same harassment. As each date was read, someone in the gallery would nod quietly, remembering their own encounter with Officer Baker. The pattern was undeniable, the evidence overwhelming. Baker's lawyer attempted to paint these incidents as misunderstandings, but the video evidence from multiple sources told a different story. Mrs. Chen's clear footage of that night left no room for alternative interpretations. During a break in the proceedings, Captain Rodriguez spoke quietly with community leaders in the courthouse hallway. "We're implementing new training programs," she explained. But more importantly, we're changing how we handle complaints. Every report will be investigated by an independent board, and all findings will be public. The afternoon session focused on the department's internal culture. Former officers testified about the pressure to stay quiet, about reports that mysteriously disappeared, about unofficial policies that protected certain officers while ignoring community complaints. A young officer, fresh from the academy, testified about being told to learn to look the other way during his training. His voice shook as he described how veteran officers had warned him about the consequences of reporting misconduct. The most damaging thing, Agent Wilson noted during his testimony, wasn't just the actions of one officer. It was the system that made people feel reporting these incidents was hopeless. That had to change. The judge listened intently, occasionally asking pointed questions that revealed her grasp of the deeper issues at play. This wasn't just about punishing one officer, it was about addressing years of institutional failure. Late in the afternoon, the courthouse steps had become a gathering place for community members who couldn't fit inside. They shared stories, supported each other, and listened to the proceedings through updates from those inside. A food truck owner had parked nearby, giving out free coffee to the waiting crowd. "It's the least I can do," he said, remembering his own encounter with Baker 2 years ago. "We're all in this together now." Inside, as the day's session drew to a close, the judge made an unexpected announcement. Given the scope of evidence presented, she declared, "This court will not only consider Officer Baker's actions, but will also review the department's complaint procedures and oversight mechanisms." The gallery buzzed with whispered conversations. This was more than they'd hoped for. A chance not just for individual accountability, but for institutional change. Angela sat in the back row, still wearing her hospital scrubs after a morning surgery. She watched as Officer Baker slumped in his chair, the weight of his actions finally catching up to him. It wasn't satisfaction she felt, but a sense that something important was finally being made right. As people filed out of the courthouse, the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. News cameras captured the moment as community members hugged each other, some wiping away tears of relief. "This isn't the end," Agent Wilson told reporters gathered outside. "It's just the beginning of real change. Today showed that when people stand together, when they refuse to be silenced, justice is possible." The courthouse lights stayed on late into the evening as the judge reviewed the evidence in her chambers. Tomorrow would bring more testimony, more revelations, more steps toward accountability. But tonight, for the first time in years, many people in the city slept with a sense that the system could work, that change was possible, that their voices mattered. 6 months after that fateful night, the community center was packed for a town hall meeting. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating a room that had become a symbol of change. The walls, once bare, now displayed photos and news clippings documenting the journey from that night to today. Captain Rodriguez, now permanently appointed as police chief, stood at the podium. Her uniform sparkled with new pins, but it was her warm smile that caught everyone's attention. 6 months ago, she began, we faced a crisis of trust. Today, I'm proud to announce that we're seeing real change. The statistics displayed on the screen behind her told a powerful story. Civilian complaints had dropped by 60%. Response times had improved in all neighborhoods. Most importantly, community trust scores had risen dramatically. Angela sat in the front row beside Agent Wilson, both of them taking notes. They'd been instrumental in designing the new oversight programs, bringing together their unique perspectives from healthcare and law enforcement. Our new Civilian Review Board has investigated 15 cases, the chief continued. Every investigation was transparent, thorough, and fair. Officers who uphold our values have nothing to fear from accountability. In the audience, Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. She'd been appointed to that review board, along with other community members who'd shown courage in standing up for change. Her phone, which had captured the video that started it all, now regularly recorded board meetings to ensure transparency. The changes went far beyond just policy. The police academy had completely revamped its training program. New officers spent time volunteering in the community before ever putting on a uniform. Veteran officers attended monthly workshops led by community members, learning about their experiences and perspectives. But perhaps the most important change, Chief Rodriguez said, her voice softening, is in how we view our role. We're not an occupying force. We're part of this community. Your safety is our safety. Your trust is our most valuable asset. The next speaker was a young officer who'd graduated from the new training program. When I was in the academy, he shared, we had dinner with different families each week. We listened to their stories, played with their kids, became part of their lives. Now when I patrol those streets, I'm not just enforcing laws, I'm protecting my neighbors. The audience applauded warmly. It was a far cry from the tension that had filled these same streets 6 months ago. Agent Wilson took the podium next, updating everyone on the broader impact of their case. What happened here has inspired changes across the country, he explained. 12 other cities have adopted similar oversight programs. The FBI has created a new task force specifically focused on building trust between law enforcement and communities. The changes had rippled through other institutions too. The hospital where Angela worked had started a program providing free medical care to victims of police misconduct. Local schools had developed new curricula teaching students about their rights and responsibilities when interacting with law enforcement. A community leader stood up during the question period. What happened to Officer Baker? She asked, voicing what many were wondering. Chief Rodriguez answered directly. He was convicted on multiple civil rights violations and is serving his sentence, but more importantly, the system that protected him is gone. His case led to the resignation of 3 supervisors and the complete restructuring of our internal affairs division. As the meeting continued, Angela thought about how much had changed since that night. Her daily drive home no longer filled her with anxiety. Her colleagues at the hospital reported similar experiences, less fear, more trust, a sense that they truly belonged in their own community. The town hall wasn't just about celebrating progress. People also spoke honestly about ongoing challenges. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. Change, even positive change, can be uncomfortable. But there was a new willingness to face these challenges together. Near the end of the meeting, a group of teenagers presented their project, a mobile app they developed that helped people understand their rights during police encounters while also highlighting positive community police interactions. It was just one of many grassroots initiatives that had sprung up in recent months. As the sun began to set, people lingered in the community center, sharing stories and plans for the future. The food truck owner who'd provided free coffee during the courthouse hearings had become a regular at these meetings, his truck now a familiar sight at community events. Outside, patrol officers chatted easily with residents, their body cameras recording every interaction, not out of suspicion, but as a mutual protection that built trust on both sides. The cameras had become symbols of transparency rather than tools of surveillance. Chief Rodriguez's final words summed up the journey. 6 months ago, we faced a choice: continue with a broken system or build something better together. We chose to build. It hasn't been easy. It hasn't been perfect. But every day, we're proving that change is possible when we have the courage to demand it and the wisdom to work for it together. As people headed home that evening, the streetlights came on one by one, just like they had that night 6 months ago. But now they illuminated something different, not a community divided by fear and mistrust, but one united in its commitment to justice, equality, and mutual respect. The story that began with one traffic stop had transformed into something much bigger, a testament to the power of standing up for what's right, the importance of bearing witness, and the possibility of real change when people come together with courage and determination.